Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever sat across from someone and wondered what was really happening behind their smile? Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling that something was left unsaid? The truth is, words are often the smallest part of communication. Every day, people tell us stories without speaking. Their eyes reveal hesitation. Their posture exposes confidence or fear. Their expressions leak emotions they never intended to show. Most people spend their lives listening to words. The few who learn to observe behavior gain access to an entirely different world. Imagine being able to walk into any room and instantly understand the emotional climate. Imagine knowing when someone is excited, uncertain, confident, nervous, honest, or hiding something important. Imagine building stronger relationships, making better decisions, and understanding people at a level most never reach. Today, we're not talking about mind reading. We're talking about something far more powerful. We're talking about learning the hidden language that every human being speaks. Because the greatest advantage in life doesn't come from talking more. It comes from seeing more. When you learn to understand human behavior, you stop guessing. You stop being manipulated by appearances. You stop missing opportunities hidden in plain sight. You begin to notice patterns. You begin to recognize intentions. And most importantly, you begin to understand people. The person who understands human nature doesn't control others. They control themselves. They remain calm when others panic. They remain focused when others are distracted. And they see opportunities where others see confusion. So today, I invite you to sharpen your awareness, challenge your assumptions, and discover how to uncover what people are really thinking. Not through magic, not through tricks, but through observation, understanding, and insight. Because once you learn to read the signals that surround you every day, you'll never look at a conversation the same way again. Let's begin. Have you ever noticed what happens when someone spends years being there for everyone else? They answer the late-night calls. They listen when others need to vent. They remember the small details that everyone else forgets. They notice when someone is struggling, even when that person is pretending to be fine. They carry emotional weight that doesn't belong to them because they genuinely care. These people have a unique ability to step into someone else's world and understand what they're feeling. But there is something most people never realize about them. The person who understands everyone else also needs to feel understood. The person who constantly gives emotional support also needs emotional support. And when that need is ignored for too long, something begins to change beneath the surface. Most people think relationships end because of major betrayals, dramatic arguments, or explosive confrontations. Sometimes they do, but some of the deepest disconnections happen quietly. They happen through 1,000 small moments that seem insignificant at the time. A feeling shared and dismissed, a concern laughed off, a vulnerable confession met with indifference. A moment of pain ignored because someone was too distracted, too self-focused, or too comfortable to notice. One incident rarely causes someone to walk away. It's the pattern that matters. It's the accumulation of moments that send a message, not through words, but through actions. The message says, "Your feelings are less important than mine." It says, "I'm happy to receive your support, but I don't have time to offer the same in return." Over time, that message becomes impossible to ignore. What makes this especially dangerous is that highly empathetic people are often incredibly patient. They don't immediately react when they're hurt. They don't demand attention every time something bothers them. In fact, they often make excuses for the people who disappoint them. They tell themselves that maybe the other person is stressed. Maybe they're going through a difficult period. Maybe they didn't mean what they said. Maybe they simply don't realize the impact of their behavior. They extend understanding long after most people would have given up. From the outside, it can look like everything is fine because they continue showing up, continue helping, continue smiling, and continue giving. But beneath that patience, something is slowly being recorded. Every ignored feeling leaves a mark. Every dismissed concern adds another layer of disappointment. Every time they reach out emotionally and receive nothing meaningful in return, they learn something about the relationship. They learn where they stand. They learn how much effort is expected from them compared to how much effort they can expect back. And perhaps most importantly, they learn whether their emotional reality matters to the people around them. This learning process doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. The challenge is that many people become accustomed to receiving emotional support without ever considering the cost. They get comfortable. They assume that the empathetic person will always be there. They begin treating that support like a permanent resource rather than a gift. They expect understanding, patience, compassion, and forgiveness as though these things are guaranteed. But nothing valuable is guaranteed. Not loyalty, not trust, not emotional presence. Every healthy connection requires reciprocity. It requires mutual care. And when that balance disappears, even the most tragic part is that people often notice the loss only after it's too late. They notice when the thoughtful messages stop arriving. They notice when the constant support disappears. They notice when the emotional warmth they relied on is no longer present. Suddenly they wonder what happened. They search for a specific event, a major argument, a single explanation. But there isn't one. The truth is far more uncomfortable. The distance was created little by little through repeated neglect of feelings that should have mattered. Human beings have an incredible ability to adapt. When someone is treated with consistent respect, they grow closer. When someone is treated with consistent indifference, they grow distant. It's not revenge. It's not punishment. It's self-preservation. No one can continue pouring emotional energy into a space where that energy is never acknowledged. Eventually, even the most compassionate person recognizes the difference between helping someone and sacrificing themselves for someone. And once that recognition becomes clear, a quiet transformation occurs. They stop chasing understanding from people who refuse to offer it. They stop explaining feelings to those who consistently dismiss them. They stop seeking validation from those who have already shown their priorities. Instead, they begin directing that energy toward themselves, toward peace, toward healing, toward relationships where emotional support flows both ways. The reason this departure feels so sudden to others is because the decision was made long before the physical distance appeared. By the time they leave, they've already spent months or even years processing the disappointment. They've already given countless chances. They've already hoped things would improve. They've already waited for empathy to be returned. When nothing changes, walking away doesn't feel impulsive to them. It feels necessary, and that's what so many people fail to understand. The quiet disappearance isn't caused by a lack of care. It's caused by caring for too long without receiving the same care in return. The person who leaves isn't abandoning the relationship in a moment of weakness. They're responding to a reality they've been observing for a very long time. A reality where their feelings were repeatedly ignored until silence became easier than speaking, distance became safer than vulnerability, and peace became more valuable than staying where they were no longer emotionally seen. There is a dangerous mistake that people make every day when they encounter someone who is genuinely kind. They look at patience and assume weakness. They see compassion and assume vulnerability. They witness forgiveness and assume there are no limits. And because of this misunderstanding, they begin treating kindness as something they can endlessly consume without consequence. They push boundaries. They take more than they give. They become careless with their words and actions because they believe the other person will always understand, always forgive, and always remain. What they fail to recognize is that kindness is not the absence of strength. In many cases, kindness is strength under control. Think about how difficult it is to remain compassionate in a world that constantly rewards aggression. It takes very little effort to become cynical. It takes very little effort to become cold, defensive, and disconnected from the emotions of others. But it takes tremendous self-control to remain understanding when people disappoint you. It takes discipline to choose patience when frustration would be easier. It takes emotional intelligence to respond with empathy when resentment would feel justified. The person who consistently demonstrates these qualities is not weak. They are exercising a level of control that many people never develop. The problem begins when someone mistakes that control for an inability to defend themselves. They see a person who avoids unnecessary conflict and assume that person fears conflict. They see someone who chooses peace and assume that person lacks options. They see someone who gives second chances and assume there will always be a third, fourth, and fifth chance waiting around the corner. This assumption creates a dangerous cycle. The more forgiving the individual appears, the more comfortable others become with behavior they would never tolerate from anyone else. Over time, respect starts to erode. Not always intentionally, not always consciously. Sometimes it happens through small acts. Promises are broken because it's assumed they'll understand. Boundaries are crossed because it's assumed they won't react. Effort becomes one-sided because it's assumed they'll continue investing regardless of what they receive in return. Little by little, the relationship becomes unbalanced. One person is carrying the emotional weight while the other is enjoying the benefits without acknowledging the cost. What makes this especially damaging is that deeply compassionate people often notice everything. They notice changes in tone. They notice inconsistency. They notice when actions no longer match words. They notice when appreciation turns into expectation. They notice when respect begins fading beneath the surface. The difference is that they don't always react immediately. They observe first. They watch patterns emerge. They gather information. They give people opportunities to correct themselves without confrontation. While others assume nothing is wrong, a quiet assessment is already taking place. Many people believe strength is measured by how loudly someone defends themselves. They assume that power is displayed through arguments, ultimatums, and public displays of authority. But some of the strongest individuals in the world operate differently. They don't waste energy proving their strength. They simply know where their limits are. They know what they will tolerate and what they won't. They understand that not every battle deserves a response. Not every offense requires confrontation. Sometimes the most powerful response is observation. This is where people become confused. They mistake silence for acceptance. They mistake patience for permission. They mistake restraint for weakness. And because they misunderstand what they're seeing, they continue behavior that slowly damages the relationship. Each act of disrespect may seem minor on its own. Each broken promise may appear insignificant. Each selfish decision may feel justified in the moment, but patterns have consequences. Human relationships are built on accumulated experiences, not isolated events. Eventually, a critical shift begins to occur. The compassionate person starts seeing the relationship through a different lens. They stop focusing on isolated incidents and start recognizing repeated behavior. They stop evaluating excuses and start evaluating results. They stop listening only to intentions and begin paying attention to actions. This change is subtle but profound. Once someone starts seeing patterns clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee them. The individual who once gave endless benefit of the doubt begins asking different questions. Why am I constantly understanding other people's mistakes while mine are judged more harshly? Why am I always expected to be patient while others make little effort to improve? Why is my kindness treated as an obligation rather than appreciated as a choice? These questions create awareness. Awareness creates clarity, and clarity changes everything. One of the greatest misconceptions about compassionate people is that they need dramatic reasons to leave. In reality, many reach their limit through accumulation. As trust erodes, behavior begins shifting in subtle ways. Conversations become shorter, vulnerability decreases. Personal information is shared less frequently. Emotional risks are avoided. The person who once revealed their deepest thoughts starts keeping those thoughts private. Not because they no longer have feelings, but because trust created the safety that allowed those feelings to be shared. When safety disappears, openness often disappears with it. The people causing the damage frequently miss these warning signs. They focus on whether the relationship still exists rather than noticing how much of it has already changed. They assume that as long as communication continues, everything is fine. They believe that as long as no dramatic confrontation occurs, trust remains intact. What they don't realize is that trust can vanish long before the relationship officially ends. There comes a moment when the empathetic person stops evaluating promises and starts evaluating patterns. This moment is powerful because it marks a shift from hope to clarity. Hope asks, what if things improve? Clarity asks, what has actually happened repeatedly? Hope focuses on possibilities. Clarity focuses on evidence, and evidence is difficult to argue with. Once someone reaches this stage, the emotional landscape changes dramatically. They no longer need explanations because they already understand the pattern. They no longer search for hidden meanings because the behavior has become consistent enough to speak for itself. The relationship is no longer being judged by intentions but by outcomes. This is where many people lose connections they assumed would last forever. The surprising part is how quiet this transformation can be. There are often no dramatic announcements, no emotional ultimatums, no explosive arguments. Instead, there is a gradual withdrawal of emotional investment. The person begins protecting parts of themselves that were once freely shared. They become more selective about where they place their energy. They stop relying on someone who has repeatedly shown they cannot be relied upon. From the outside, it may appear as though the relationship changed overnight. In reality, the change has usually been developing for months or even years. Every broken promise contributed to it. Every dishonest moment accelerated it. Every repeated disappointment reinforced it. What looks sudden is often the final stage of a process that began long ago. One of the hardest truths for people to accept is that trust has a threshold. Many assume there will always be another opportunity, another explanation, another chance to make things right. Sometimes there is, but opportunities are not unlimited. Every relationship contains invisible boundaries. Every person has a point where accumulated evidence outweighs accumulated hope. Once that point is reached, rebuilding becomes extraordinarily difficult. The reason is simple. Trust is not merely belief in another person's character. It is confidence in what future experiences will look like. When repeated actions consistently create disappointment, the future becomes predictable. The empathetic person no longer wonders what might happen. They already know. The pattern has answered the question for them. And that is why repeated breaches of trust are so destructive. They don't simply damage a single moment. They reshape expectations. They alter perception. They change how a person sees the entire relationship. By the time the consequences become visible, the emotional decision has often already been made. Not because the person stopped caring, not because they became cold, but because trust, once repeatedly broken, eventually reaches a point where preserving personal peace becomes more important than preserving a connection built on uncertainty. Before we close, I want you to think about something. How many relationships have ended long before anyone actually walked away? Not because of one argument, not because of one mistake, but because trust was broken one too many times, kindness was taken for granted, and feelings were repeatedly ignored. The truth is, people who care deeply rarely leave quickly. They stay, they try, they forgive, they hope. They give second chances that most people never even hear about. They fight silent battles inside themselves, searching for reasons to keep believing in the connection. But every person has a limit. Every heart has a breaking point, and every relationship is built upon foundations that cannot be neglected forever. If someone's feelings are constantly dismissed, they eventually stop sharing them. If someone's kindness is constantly exploited, they eventually stop offering it. If someone's trust is repeatedly broken, they eventually stop rebuilding it. And when that moment arrives, the departure is often silent. No dramatic speech, no final warning, no desperate attempt to be understood. Just distance, just silence. Just the realization that protecting their peace has become more important than preserving a connection that no longer feels safe. So here's the question I want you to carry with you today. Are the people in your life feeling valued, respected, and understood? Or have you simply become accustomed to their presence? Because the people who seem strongest are often carrying the heaviest emotional weight. The people who complain the least are often enduring the most. And the people who always seem to be there are often the ones nobody imagines could ever leave. Until one day, they do. Remember, this trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. Respect grows through consistency. And appreciation should never begin only after someone is gone. The greatest relationships are not built on perfection. They are built on attention. Attention to feelings. Attention to boundaries. Attention to trust. because when people feel seen, heard, and valued, they stay. But when they feel invisible, used, or repeatedly betrayed, they don't always fight. Sometimes they simply disappear. And by the time their absence teaches the lesson, the opportunity to learn it from their presence is already gone. Thank you.